College football nerds here talking Florida and Kentucky. We did a Florida and Utah preview last week. Both picked Florida. People called us crazy. Florida won, so we're taking a little bit of a revisit of that and talking about the Kentucky game. I got Josh with me here. He's getting nerdy. We're going to be talking a little, not as many numbers this time because we don't have enough data to really get into it. So we're going to talk a little bit about teams, a little bit about schemes. Didn't mean to rhyme, but I did it anyway. Josh, with the Utah game, first of all, everybody thought we were crazy. The line was only 3 points. We both picked Florida for a couple of reasons. One, we thought Anthony Richardson would give them fits. He did. We thought that Utah, unless they really got into Florida's depth, which they did at the end of the game, unless they really got into Florida's depth, the frontline talent, they were outmatched. And then we gave the home crowd really the reason that would put things into a tipping point for Florida, which I think it did. But Josh, looking at this game, they're coming off a huge win on number 7 Utah. And they got Kentucky coming into town, who didn't look great in the first half. They turned it on late against Miami of Ohio. They're at home, and it's only a 4-point spread. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the spread for this game is only 4.5. Now we kind of flagged right with the Utah game that it was only a few points, but now it's kind of spreading the other way, right? That was a top 10 Utah. I picked Florida 31-28. You picked Florida 24-20. I feel like we got a little bit of right to talk about it, but do you agree with me? I feel like the fact that this is a 4.5 point spread in Florida's favor kind of means this is the exact same situation as the Utah game, but in reverse. I feel like Kentucky is the under-respected underdog here and is probably, dare I say, a Utah light in this matchup?
Yeah, I think Utah light really kind of puts him in trouble because of scheme, but I also think that you're right. It's only 4 points, which might surprise people. We keep telling people to stop being surprised about Kentucky and their brand name. Big Ten fans get at us all the time, and we're like, you say Kentucky's overrated, but you keep losing to them in bowl game.
Boom. Roasted.
So maybe they're just good and you don't want to give them credit. I think that Vegas doesn't care about any of that. They don't care about brand name. They don't care about who you beat last week. They care about obviously getting the money right. And people always say that. They want money on both sides. So it's not about predicting a win. But if they predict Florida by 50, obviously they're not going to get the money right. So they got to get close in some regards. So yeah, I think you're right that they're giving Kentucky a lot of credit that maybe people who saw the first half of that game last week and then saw Florida play Utah aren't giving them.
Yeah, and I think the most difficult thing when you're trying to evaluate these two teams really is trying to understand how you try to measure the performance of Kentucky in a game against Miami of Ohio, where they sleptwalk for a half. They don't have a ton of firepower relative to SEC standards right now, but they do have a good offensive line. They do have good backs. It didn't necessarily show at times, but when they got going, they got going. And you also have two very different quarterbacks, right? Cam Rising was a running quarterback, and I think they gave a lot of fits to Florida in just trying to keep the edge and containment. Whereas with Will Levis, you've got a guy that, yeah, he's mobile, but he's definitely a downfield passer, way more than Cam Rising is. And this gets back to a concept we've talked a lot, right? Florida gets Ventrell Miller back at linebacker. My big concerns with Florida have always been, ever since they had McElwain and it kind of continued on a Mullen, they don't have the top end athleticism on that defense as you would expect. And at times they can kind of give up the edge, and at times they kind of struggle a little bit with speed. And if they're kind of reduced to a sound pound and ground defense and offense with Richardson, that's kind of Kentucky's ball game, right?
Yeah, I think it is. Although I will also say that not just, we said Utah light, and I think that some of that might be in the trenches for once. But one thing I will say that, you talk about them being downfield, but they're also a little more creative offensively than I thought Utah was. But turning that back around, Josh, one of the things that really hurt Florida was Cam Rising running the ball consistently and keeping the chains moving. Is that going to be Kentucky's MO in this game too, or are they going to try to test Florida with some shots?
Well, I'm not going to say Florida fans aren't used to shots, but I do think that there's a potential for Kentucky to rely more on the ground and pound. I think the jury's still out a little bit on what Utah really is as a team. I certainly think the jury's out on Oregon, but as a whole in the Pac-12, it's so hard to evaluate these teams because they stay isolated, they play each other, and what looks like a football team that's really physical in the Pac-12 may turn out not to be physical at all. I mean, Utah did sort of annihilate Oregon a couple times physically last year, but I'm not sure how much that means after having seen Georgia play them. So I do think Kentucky is going to try to stay in good down and distance, try to lean on Cavassier smoke, try to lean on the fact that they've got some big physical players, knowing they don't have maybe the top end explosive athletes. There's no Wan'Dale Robinson on that roster. And there's certainly not a Randall Cobb, right? So I don't think that they're going to try to go downfield that much. I think they're going to rely on Levis to be efficient. One thing I think we should mention too is Rodriguez was out of the game for Kentucky. He's still suspended. It was week 1. The running game was very ineffective, only averaging a couple yards per carry. But look, it was week 1. Things are rough. I think both of us are kind of making an assumption based off recent history that Kentucky's going to be able to run the ball well, but I'd kind of be remiss if we didn't at least mention that. And if we can, I want to turn the conversation around a little bit too and say, I think a lot of Florida fans are going to object to this and say, well, we've got an offense that's going to be so good that we're going to be able to score 1 billion points and we're going to be able to put up a ton on Kentucky, because if we can do this to Utah, we can do it on Kentucky. And part of this conversation is I think Kentucky can stay in the game scoring with a kind of consistent down and distance offense, in large part because I don't really buy that Florida is going to explode.
Yeah, I think that, and look, Florida fans aren't going to like me saying this. They've already got at me a little bit from our top 10, which we both had Florida in our top 10 in week 1. We both have them in our top 10 in week 2. People called us crazy for not having Utah in our top 10 in week 1 and having Florida there. We can take a victory lap on that. But all that to say that we don't hate on Florida. We've been talking about how Anthony Richardson is going to be a big part of this offense and a big weapon for them. In week 1 against Utah, there were some things I didn't love. I think he had like 7.5 yards per attempt passing. And that's not just a box score watching thing. There were some times where that offense sputtered. And running the ball, yeah, he had the long 45-yarder or whatever. And I think that one thing that's great about them is they're good in the red zone. They're like the reverse of Georgia, where Georgia is unstoppable between the 20s. You can maybe slow them down. The only way you can beat them is maybe slow them down in the red zone. I think Florida's different in that they're going to struggle a little more between the 20s. But if you get them in that 10-yard, 10, 15-yard range from the goal line, they're going to score every time. So I've got some reservations with Anthony Richardson right now. I don't know that I have them in week 7 or 8, but I have them right now because this is still a new offensive system for him. He's still running the show, and it's a lot to learn. I think he did learn a lot in that week 1, but I don't know that we can just chalk up 40 points for Florida every week yet. I think that there's going to be some 3 or 4 drives in a row where they put up points, and then 3 or 4 drives in a row where they go 3 and out.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, if you look at the box score, again, box scores aren't everything. We do watch the games, but it does help try to make sense of what you've seen. I mean, Anthony Richardson had over 100 yards rushing on 11 carries, but if you're running for 7.3 yards per carry in a game, you expect to probably score more than 29 points. Why did that happen? It's because the passing game was inconsistent. And the key to an efficient offense is, one, staying in short down and distance, but more than anything, it's having a passing game that can really bail you out. That's how you take an efficient offense. I say key to an efficient offense, key to an efficiently scoring offense, right? How do you take an offense that's very efficient, make them score points? You've got to have the ability to convert with your arm, not just with legs. And I think that's what holds Florida scoring down. And I think it's going to be a problem, frankly, for them all year. Last year, we talked a lot about the fact that I didn't think Anthony Richardson was ready. I know a lot of Florida fans feel like he should have started game 1 and worked into it. I don't think he was anywhere close to being able to run that scheme, frankly. I think you can put that on Dan Mullen having the wrong scheme for him, and we were critical about that. I think they have a better scheme for what Richardson is and what he can do. But if you're looking for them to expand that scheme to be a lot more aggressive with how they throw downfield, I think that's kind of a mistake. I think Richardson executes really well with his arm throwing to point targets. he still misses some things about how routes develop, about how, you want to do certain concepts. And particularly it's things like blitz pickup, how to do a hot read. Those are things he really struggled with last year. I think he's better at it. He's still not 100% there. So that does limit you a little bit offensively. And again, I'm a guy that picked Florida to win that game last week by 3 points and had him in my top 10 to start the season. I have a lot of faith in Florida, but I also am aware of their limitations. So for me, that's kind of the big deal. I think they're going to run the ball well. I don't know that they're going to run for 7.3 yards per carry. I think they're going to throw the ball a little better, and I think it balances out to around the same performance. And do you mind if we go ahead and get into score predictions now?
I want to ask you one question before you give us your score, because I've been thinking through this. I've been thinking through this a little bit based on what I saw Saturday, and I do think that there is an analog to Kentucky and to Utah, and that's out of respect for Kentucky. We have been Kentucky stands on this show for a while, and people just don't listen to us. This might be where I frustrate some Kentucky fans a little bit, but tell me if you agree with this. Levis better than Rising, but Utah roster better than Kentucky roster.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I was looking at the defensive roster earlier, and they've got some guys like, Jaquez Jones or Afari that can sort of rush the passer and some guys like that. But I feel like at its core, Utah has a strong roster top to bottom.
And they've got like a super senior laden roster too. Like they've got a lot of experience on that roster.
Yeah.
And so going into where now one thing we said about that game is because of COVID and because of the Pac-12 and sort of the rotational stuff, Utah had not played in a really hostile environment. Oregon is the best example, and they hadn't played in Oregon since 2017. So nobody on that roster has really played in that environment. Kentucky players have. So I think that's one thing where they're not going to be shell-shocked in that kind of way, maybe that Utah was. But, yeah, go ahead and give me your score. I just wanted to think through that a little bit. But, yeah, give me your score.
So my score is 27-24 Florida. And I'm sure is that your score too? Is that where you're laughing?
Well, give me your teams first.
Okay, well, 27 Florida, 24 Kentucky.
I'm 27-23.
Okay,
right there.
Well, yeah, and if you look at the spread, and again, we do our predictions without looking at the spread, but it is kind of informative. I think if your prediction's in line with the spread, if you call someone crazy, you're being a little ridiculous and you need to look at yourself, because Vegas does, in these games, they're trying to set on the average result. There's some others where they play games and they try to goad you into something, but people know people are high on Florida, and if they're giving Kentucky a lot of credit, if anything, you should be concerned that they're underplaying Kentucky because they know people are going to be high on Florida this week. But yeah, it's a 52-point over-under, 4.5-point spread, 27-24 is 3 points, and 51 over-under. And there's a reason we're both at that number, and there's a reason Vegas is. I think that's the most likely outcome in this game. I feel like Florida's going to look like the better team. I just think they're going to have a hard time separating themselves a lot on the scoreboard.
See, I'm a little different. I think Florida is the better team. I think they might look early like not the better team. That was a tough game last week. I'm sure it took its toll. And while Kentucky didn't look great, they could kind of put it on cruise control and win that game. It also means they didn't have to show a lot of tape to Florida. So they've got wrinkles.
I was going to say that.
They've got wrinkles. They can hold them back, and so I think that there's some of that there that's going to show Kentucky better early. But the other thing, people are going to say, well, what if they just, if they're able to stop Anthony Richardson? Look, it's not like Utah didn't plan for that going into that game. Some people are just that good that you can't stop them. So, Josh, one more thing before we close this out. Are we in we're on the edge of variability zone? You talk about people saying you can't call somebody crazy if they're picking this close. If we, look up and this score is 27-23 Kentucky at the end of the game, that's completely expected, right? Like we're that result doesn't surprise us at all, right?
Yeah, we say a lot of times the closer the score gets to 15 points, basically, the more variability comes into play. Because at this level, you're only talking about 3 or 4 scoring possessions. So one call back to yesterday, one muff punt, 2 muff punts, you probably lose the ball game. If Florida is -2 or higher in the turnover margin, that's saying that's probably enough to lose. So anytime you're below 30 points, variability is a major factor, and certainly when you get to the low 20s or high teens, almost anything can happen. No result will shock me. It won't shock me if Florida, one muff punt from Kentucky, and suddenly this is 31-17, right? So this is a game that's very much on the knife's edge, but definitely I think an maybe underappreciated game in terms of the national landscape and in terms of competitiveness, and Vegas is flagging it, right? This is a game where Kentucky is a ranked team for a reason. They're a good football team. They got to slow play last week, break some stuff in, hide whatever wrinkles they want to throw in, while Florida had to put all their cards on the table. This is really perfectly set up, I think, for Kentucky to pull an upset if they want to. I don't think they do, but they're set up well to do it.
And look, I said on the show, I've got Florida in my top 10. I don't expect the AP to have them in there at the end of the year because they're going to lose some games. They got a tough schedule. This is one of those games, Josh, where I'm not dinging Florida if they lose this game. If Kentucky wins this game, it doesn't change my perception. I don't get sour on Florida and think they were overhyped coming out of Utah. I just think a lot of the factors, like you said, are working against them to win the game. I still think they do, but if they don't, I'm not shocked. But one last thing before we wrap it up, Josh, is it true or false? The winner of this game is going to get way overvalued potentially, and the loser of this game is going to get a bigger hit on their perception than they should.
No, totally. I think the loser of this game is going to take a bigger hit than they should. I think the winner is going to rise up in the rankings, but they're just not going to credit whoever loses, particularly if Florida beats Kentucky. And this is where there's some distinctions, right? We kind of, with Notre Dame, didn't give a ton of credit to Ohio State for losing that one close or winning that one close. And that's because I think Notre Dame is maybe a top 15 team, not a top 10 team. I think Kentucky is legitimately a top 25 team. Like, I don't think Kentucky is that much worse than Notre Dame. And I'll be honest, I think Kentucky may be better than anyone on Utah's schedule. I think they probably are better than Oregon. They might be better than USC. We'll see where their defense is really at. So I don't think you're going to get credit if you lose the way you should. I certainly don't think you're going to get credit if you win the way you should. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that's true in this game. It's just people don't respect the Kentucky brand, and I think that's all it really comes down to. And not nearly as much as they should.
They should, because they keep winning. But yeah, I think that we're right on it here. I would venture to say that Kentucky might be better than Notre Dame, which is why, Ohio State fans got mad at us for not giving them credit for beating a top 5 team. But look, think of all the other times that Notre Dame's been top 5 when they played someone who won a national championship. They got killed. So if Ohio State wants to be judged by that, then they're going to get kind of criticized. In the same vein, we're not judging Florida or Kentucky as national champions, so we give a little bit of fudge on that end, in terms of like, if you want to be a solid top 15 team, these are your warts, but we're not going to really crush you for it. I think the loser of this game is going to get unfairly crushed. All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to be. This is a really fun one. We're looking forward to it, and we want to mix it up with y'all. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.